Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Roxanne Fenton. I am the Associate Director in Career and Professional Development. And today we're going to talk about some basics of the American workplace. So thanks for coming. So just to kind of lay the ground of what I'm going to cover are some expectations and some practices that you are likely to see in an American workplace. These are going to necessarily be kind of general because there is variation by the region of the country that you work in, the size of the company, the industry, and then every individual organization develops its own culture. So those are things you're going to want to pay attention to and get to know about in any place that you work. But hopefully this will give you kind of a landscape that you can start to fit those experiences into. A lot of these expectations that you're going to encounter are unspoken. It's just assumed that somehow you will know them. And I think that's one of the reasons that I really wanted to do this workshop is because how are we supposed to learn about them if nobody tells us? So I wanted to do a little telling. And then these expectations often develop unconsciously. People maybe not even realize that they have them. They're influenced by people's cultural expectations, their unconscious biases, even by stereotypes. So this unspoken nature of this can be a problem because it's not necessarily a fair situation for everyone. So our goal with this workshop is, like I said, to peel back some of that curtain and let you see what's going on. And so that you can just start to decide how to interact in and navigate in an American workplace. You know, not following the culture of your workplace can have consequences, but you also need to keep your own values in mind. So I'm not saying this is everything you need to do or this is how you need to behave, because that's going to be up to you. But I just want you to understand kind of what's out there. So that's my background for where we're going today. And I have 4 big topics that we're going to cover. Time is a very cultural concept. And so I want to talk some about how many Americans have expectations around time in the workplace. We're going to talk about company structure, both in some general ways and in some very specific ways. We're going to talk about relationship building at work, knowing other people, and that of course includes networking. And then we'll talk some more specifics about some ways of communicating and some communication that may be expected. So let's talk about time. I have a poll that I made to see what different relationships to time we might have in the audience today. So it's just one simple question. What did you grow up with as being on time? Which of these options kind of best fits you and the family or the culture or the country or whatever that you are from, the part of the country that sort of best says, this is how I see being on time. So I'll just give you a minute to answer that and give me the best answer that you can based on the options I gave you. We've got 6 of 9. Can we get all 9? Okay. I think we've got what we're going to get. So let me just share. I'm going to end the poll. and share the results. So you can see that within the group of people who answered, everybody picked one of the first three options that I gave you. But all of these options are actually ways that people in different parts of the world, in different parts of America, have to relating to time. And your relationship to time may be influenced by what you learned in school, may be influenced by what you learned in the family. But let's talk about how it tends to work in the workplace. All right. So what does being on time mean? You will find that in most American workplaces, one of the top three is what's expected. And that being on time is often an expectation that employers have. And it can be almost surprisingly important to people that you are on time. There may be one expectation to showing up to work. So for example, maybe you work in LA, and like a lot of people in LA feel, there's always a grace period because you never know what you're going to run into with traffic. And so being, 5 to 10 minutes late for work is totally fine. But when it comes to meetings, the expectation is that you are early, or you are, absolutely right on time. Unfortunately, you can also find that there are supervisors out there who have one standard for you as their employee and another maybe looser standard for themselves. So it's good to, as with everything that I'm going to discuss today, to pay attention both to what people say and what they do. Though know that they, you may need to do as they say, not as they do. So in general, American supervisors are going to expect you to be on time, fairly close to the time that something is set to start, and that being late is looked down upon. In general, again, there are individual variances. So from that, let's talk about another way that time works in American businesses, and that is, how strict are deadlines? Do they change? And what if you think you can't make a deadline? I think generally you're expected to meet deadlines without a lot of prompting. Most supervisors say they don't want to have to watch over someone closely to make sure that they are on track with a project. But there's kind of a continuum that you'll find that may depend on the industry, may depend on the area of design that you're in. It may depend on how many other teams you're coordinating with. And Salman, I think this goes to your question about how do they manage workflow across teams. So in some organizations, deadlines are very fixed and they're really not movable. And that may be due to external factors like client expectations, that may be due to internal preferences on the part of the company, a culture, an individual. One thing that's kind of nice in that situation is once a deadline is established, you can kind of count on it to stay the same. So if something has to be done by a particular day, that day is not going to fluctuate back and forth. A different way of approaching deadlines is that the path of the project may not be laid out in great detail, and deadlines may move around as the project develops. So the culture of the company or the team may be a little more exploratory, and they may not set a firm deadline until they have a better idea of how the project is going. Or they may just feel like the deadline is something that doesn't need to be very fixed. So getting a handle on how your team, how your studio, your company feels about deadlines is a good thing to understand at any place that you're working. And it's really important to communicate to your manager or your supervisor if you think you're going to have trouble meeting a deadline. I see this with internships a lot, that interns run into trouble. They fall behind or something comes up that's preventing them from getting their work done. And the supervisor gets upset because the intern didn't communicate about that. They didn't stay in touch. So why do you communicate? Is it going to change anything? It might. Depending on the project or the situation, a deadline might be extended. The supervisor might help you prioritize your work, decide this is important to do now, this can wait till later, so that you can meet the most important deadline. And sometimes if the whole team is having trouble with a project, maybe they will add someone else to the project to help you meet the deadline. So with deadlines in general, advice is to communicate early, give context. So don't just say, hey, I'm having trouble meeting this deadline, but say why, what's going on? You know, I'm having a health issue. I've been out sick, or we discovered something that we hadn't even considered that needs to be done. Or I just have too many things that I've been given to do and I don't know which I'm supposed to do first. If it's right in that situation, you can even suggest solutions for what might help you meet a deadline successfully. So time in terms of arrival, time in terms of deadlines. Let's talk about time spent working. There's a couple of ways to think about this. In the US, a full-time job usually is considered 40 hours a week. Not always, can be less, but legally, it depends if it can be more. There's two ways that you're going to be paid with respect to time. Either you're going to make an hourly wage, in which case, if the company expects you or asks you to work more than 40 hours a week, you are legally required to be paid overtime. And so usually that's time and a half. So your regular rate plus half of your regular rate added to that. And, you know, in a lot of companies, overtime isn't allowed. So you have to watch very carefully that you don't work longer if you're hourly than your 40 hours a week. And in other companies, it's a thing that you can get approved in advance if you're working hourly. The other way that you might be paid is on a salary where you get a set amount regardless of how many hours you work, with the expectation that you're working those 40 hours a week. So you get paid the same amount, whether it's every 2 weeks or every month. Your annual income is understood to be a set amount. For the most part, and I'm not getting into all the legal complications of this, but for the most part, people who are on salary are not paid overtime. They're not required by law to be paid overtime. So this is where a company that has, you know, kind of a company culture of working 50, 60 hours a week, that's kind of how they get away with it, is everybody is paid on a salary. And it's just an expectation that that's the kind of hours that you'll put in above that 40-hour a week. So that's also something good to figure out what the culture of the company is when you go into an interview or as you're doing your research on the company. Then there's the way that supervisors see the time you spend working throughout the day. Most American employers expect that you will be working consistently for the workday, minus any allowed breaks. So, you get an hour for lunch, you get a 15-minute break in the morning and a 15-minute break in the afternoon. But otherwise they expect that you're going to be working. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're working every second, as we're going to talk about, office communication and chats and things that happen. But it does mean that you are generally expected that you're not spending excessive time on your phone or engaged in other non-work activities during the day. That's an expectation you're going to find in a lot of places. This has been a really interesting situation for employers and employees with the pandemic, when so much work shifted to remote. And there are a lot of companies and a lot of managers who are really uncomfortable with remote work because they don't feel like they can tell if you are working as much as you're supposed to. And so remote work requires a lot of trust that the employee is getting the work done, and management isn't really concerned about the minute-to-minute productivity of those employees. So this can be nice if you're working remote because your day can be a little more flexible. It requires trust. And in general, what you hope for in a work relationship is that your supervisor is not standing over your shoulder, micromanaging, what we call micromanaging every moment, but that they trust you that you're getting your work done. And part of building that trust is demonstrating that you're not spending a lot of time, like I said, on your phone or doing other things during the workday. So that's kind of an expectation. And then I have one more way to think about time.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
The hourly pay, you said if you work overtime, you have to pay you half the hourly wage plus the half amount added to it?
That's usually what happens if
And
you're an hourly employee.
this is like a state law or different from state to state?
I think it's federal, so it should be pretty consistent. They will let you know what your overtime rate is when you're hired.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So you may discover another way that a company or a team sees time. And this is on a spectrum. So, it's not just at one end or the other, but kind of in between. And this is how many things people work on at once, or how much people spread their focus out. So at one end, people really tend to only do one thing at a time. The day gets scheduled out and people work through their tasks the way that they've scheduled them. And in a situation like this, interruptions are a big deal because they interfere with that planned set of tasks. And so it's good to know if this is the kind of environment that you're in, or if you're in an environment that leans this direction, because you want to make interruptions carefully. You want to find a good time, maybe a time in the day, to save up all your questions for a supervisor, and maybe schedule a time to ask questions. Or maybe you ask your questions via email or via text, like Slack or Discord, so that the supervisor can look at them as fits their schedule. Deadlines tend to be fixed. This tends to go along with that fixed deadline culture. On the other end, things are much more fluid. You can have multiple priorities going on at once. Interruptions are much more common. So it's not a big deal to say to somebody, hey, do you have a minute? And ask them a question. People don't tend to schedule their tasks as carefully. And deadlines often move around a little bit more. Most places, I think, are a combination of these, and you will find people in teams and companies who tend towards one end of this or the other. So, you know, it can seem, you know, to someone who is very flexible about time, it can seem that someone who plans their time very carefully is very rigid. But to the person who plans their time very carefully, it can seem that the person who has a more flexible approach to time is very disorganized. So again, this is something you want to learn, what the culture is in your organization, what your team is like, what your supervisor is like, so that you can make the best choices about how to work with them. And you may need to practice for yourself setting boundaries around managing your time. This happens a lot. I'll just give you one example. There's been a move in the last 15, 20 years in some industries to an open plan office. So there are no walls, there are no cubicles. Everybody sits at tables or at little workstations and can see everybody else and can hear what's going on. And interruptions are really easy in that situation because everybody's out there and it's really easy to be like, hey, does somebody know the answer to this? And so one thing that people will often do in a situation like that is wear headphones so that they can signal that they are deep in work and are not easy to interrupt. People can wear headphones for a lot of different reasons, focus, tuning out background noise, a lot of things like that. But that's one way of sort of setting a boundary around interruptions. Another area where you can learn to set boundaries is about meetings. Hopefully you won't have supervisors who want to schedule meetings over lunch, over your designated lunch break. And you have to kind of learn as you get to know your supervisor, as you get to know your team and the culture, where you can say like, no, I'm really not free for a meeting at that time. Could we meet at another time? Could we meet at 2 o'clock? If you can see everybody's calendar and see when people are free, something like that. So that's another way that time culture will show up in a company. We are recording, but if you want to unmute yourself or put it in the chat, any other questions about time and the way that people treat time or have expectations around time?
So you usually can see other people's timeline when you have like access to like a system. I think I've noticed like even in Art Center, people have like their own timeline shared table that everyone can see.
Often you can see, it depends, but often you can see the calendars of your team. Yeah. Or you may not be able to see as much of the calendar of a person who works, say, above you. But often at equal levels, it's possible to see people's calendars because that's one of the ways that people will schedule meetings is through looking for an open spot. So it's a common thing, but it's not a guaranteed thing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions before we move on? All right. Let's talk about company structure. I have one broad area I'm going to talk about this, and then I'm going to go into some details about some particular parts of a typical American company. And one is how people report to each other, who has supervision over others, and who has the power to make decisions. So again, this can go all the way from something that is very strictly structured and very hierarchical, like my graphic on the left, where decisions tend to be made at the top. or you really need to check with the person you report to before you undertake a new project, or it's considered bad form to go above someone in the structure. So you would talk to someone in the pink category before you would talk to the person they report to in the blue category. And you probably wouldn't maybe reach the person at the top directly at all. So one way to know how strictly structured your team and your company is that hopefully when you are brought on board and you're trained, one of the things they'll share is an organizational chart called an org chart, where you can see who reports to whom, and you can see how the company is structured. That's at one extent. At the very other extreme is what's called a flat organization, where it's generally considered that people are on the same level. Maybe the head of the company stands above everybody else, but the idea is that decisions are made by the people who have the information to make the decisions, or who has the good idea, and that you don't have to worry so much about who reports to whom. Very few big organizations can manage a flat organization. You tend to see those more in very small companies, in startups. The thing to watch out for, if you know that the company says, oh, we have a flat organization, is that often there's people have hidden power, that like really there is a person you need to check with. And there is kind of a structure of who has whose ideas get more weight, or who has decision-making power. So those are things that you need to understand about a company, regardless of what the organization looks like on paper. It's something to come to understand about the individual company that you're working for. Now, one thing that might be different for depending on where you come from, is that hierarchy doesn't necessarily follow age. So that young managers can supervise designers who are older than them. Seniority, who's been at the job the longest, may not be the same thing as age. And it may or may not matter. So the hierarchy tends to depend on position. It tends to depend on maybe knowledge, various things, but it's not necessarily by age in an American company. And you may find a fairly flatly structured design team working in an otherwise hierarchical company. I think this happens at very large companies where they kind of need the hierarchy to keep things organized, but individual teams don't need to function that way and function differently. Hierarchy doesn't mean you can't talk to people who are further up in the organization than you are. It just means that you may need to ask, your supervisor for an introduction to their supervisor and have a good reason for that, particularly if it's a strong hierarchy. Art Center has several org charts. I don't know that they're available to students, but they are available to employees. And with the academic realignment, that has created a need for changes in that. But yes, Art Center does have org charts. Okay, I want to talk to you about 3 very important offices or departments that companies of any size can have. And they're ones you want to know about and you want to know how to interact with. So one is what's called HR, which stands for Human Resources. In recent years, those offices have been changing their names. So sometimes they're known as People and Culture. At Art Center, it's Employee Experience and Engagement. shifting to an idea that's less about sort of managing humans as a resource to dealing with people at an organization. I'm going to talk about HR in a little more detail in just a minute. IT stands for information technology. And these are the people who do everything from manage the internet and the wireless to make sure that every employee has a computer, to this is who you call when a Microsoft product is not working right, or any product, is just famously Microsoft. This is who helps you with your email. So anything that deals with the technology, the systems, the software, the hardware, deals with printers, deals with the network. These are good people to know and to be on friendly terms with, because it's a lot easier to get pleasant help from them when something goes wrong and you need it. So always good to know the IT team. And then the payroll team, and I'm going to talk a little bit about payroll in a minute. This is who handles your paychecks and your time cards and make sure that you get paid on time, that you get paid the right amount. So also another very important office that I'm going to get to in just a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about HR, which may be a completely new idea to you, or maybe something you've encountered. But what does human resources do? And the list can be long. And in a big company, there'll be subdivisions of human resources that deals with various things. I put compliance on here because in a lot of ways, this is the office that is responsible for making sure that the company is meeting federal guidelines related to hiring people and payment and contracts, that they are managing state laws, that they are handling compliance with company policies. So that's one big umbrella to look at HR as. But you first encounter HR usually when you're hired, especially if HR handles recruitment for the company. The very first person you talk to after your application may be someone from human resources. This works all the way through your time at the company. Usually your benefits, health insurance, if other insurances are offered, those are handled. Retirement accounts, those are usually handled by this office. Most companies have some kind of annual evaluation. Those are usually coordinated by human resources. Human resources can do other things like being responsible for organizational culture. They can promote health and wellness initiatives. They can offer professional development opportunities. They're often, well, they usually are, not often, but pretty much always, the office that gets brought in when discipline needs to happen. If someone is violating company policy or engaging in harassment of other coworkers, or needs to be sort of indicated that they're not doing what they need to be doing, human resources is usually, again, on a compliance level brought in for that. And then often diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts have been put under human resources. Not always, but sometimes. So this is an office that you are going to regularly interact with from the time that you are hired to the time that you leave. And I think Eilish has put a link in the chat to an article that can kind of explain this in a little more detail so that you can start to understand the purpose of this office and how you might interact with them. I wanted to go over payroll just a little bit. And this is what we call a pay stub. This is not an actual one, this is a template. But this is what you get when you get a paycheck. Especially if you do direct deposit and the money goes right into your bank. You don't get a physical check, but you do get a pay stub. And it lays out key information about you, will identify your regular salary, if you're hourly, any overtime, and any bonuses. You'll see kind of like what you make. And you can see that in that this middle box called earnings. What I wanted to point out is that often there is money that comes out of your paycheck, usually much of it before you're charged taxes by the federal government or the state government. And what some of those sources are. So one thing you'll see is Medicare. This is where every person who's working pays into a fund that then funds in healthcare for people who have retired over 65, people who have a disability or need health insurance under some other conditions. Social Security is another pot of money that American workers pay into. It's managed like Medicare by the federal government, and it is there to provide not a pension, not retirement money per se, but usually you get Social Security after you retire, after you reach a certain age and stop working. You can also, again, get Social Security if you are disabled and can't work anymore. There are some other conditions as well. So these are things that you are paying into with the idea that you get back from that pool of money at a later stage when you need it. Not often, but your insurance premiums, the money that you pay, that you contribute towards health insurance, dental insurance, other kinds of insurance will come out of your paycheck before taxes are charged on it. And then usually the government and the state government withhold some money towards the taxes that you will owe at the end of the year. So it's important to check your pay stubs regularly to make sure that there aren't any errors and to make sure that you understand everything that is happening with your paycheck and with the money that's going to various programs and funds. All right, I am running long, so I'm going to keep moving. Relationships are important. Human beings working together, that means relationships. And I just want to talk a little bit about how we build relationships, how we start to build relationships with our coworkers, with our supervisors. And that is that most places, there's a certain amount of casual office talk that is usually expected. This is one of those things people may not say they expect, but they're looking for what often feels like small talk. Talking about the traffic on the way to work, the weather, the Super Bowl game over the weekend, the music that you heard in the car, how the weekend went, what you did in general terms. These are all things that come up in casual office talk. And it's not the topics that are so important, because they're usually very casual things like that, but that it's a way to build relationships and let people get to know, to feel like they know who you are. It helps people feel connected to those they usually work with. Small talk isn't comfortable for everybody. And Eilish posted our small talk resource that talks a little bit about how that might not be comfortable for you. But if you consistently avoid general studio or office conversation, you may be perceived as unapproachable or not invested in the organization. So this is where people kind of have these unspoken expectations about how people will get along in a business or office setting, studio setting. And they will make assumptions about people based on how they participate in them. So knowing that you're going to participate in a certain amount of casual office talk is important. This brings up different ways that Americans, as a big category, tend to communicate. And so I picked out three different ways that communication happens. The first one is it more transactional or is it more interpersonal? Transactional means it's about the information, it's about what you need to do to get the job done. It's sharing information, it's sharing details. It's not as personal. It's not really about who you are as a person outside of work. Americans tend to be on the more transactional end of communicating. So that means that compared to other places, you may not get to know your coworkers really deeply, or it may take a while to build a real friendship that extends outside the workplace. This is different than other places. Even other places in the US, there are some places in the US that are more interpersonal and some places that are more transactional. There's a range within different kinds of companies, but don't be surprised if you come from a culture where it's really important to get to know the person. Don't be surprised if that feels a little hard to do in an American workplace. This kind of explains why. Another axis for this is to think about communication as low context or high context. Low context means you don't need a lot of surrounding context to understand what a person is trying to say. You can pretty much take what they say as what they mean. So this is some of the cultures that tend to be low context are the US, Canada, Australia, Germany, where if you ask, can I do something? And somebody starts out by saying, sure, that's okay, that's an answer. You got your answer and you can go with that answer. There are other cultures, and again, you'll find these within the US as well, that are high context. So to really understand what a person is saying, you need a lot of context about their body language, their facial expression, their relationship to you, dynamics between people in a social situation. You need a lot of context to understand what's being said. Japan, Korea, Indonesia, China, Kenya are all examples of high context cultures. So if you know you're from, whether it's a family culture or a country culture or wherever it comes from, if you know that you're from one of these, then it's good to know how to interact with people who are from the other one. So that help not have miscommunication. And then the last way of communicating that I identified was direct versus indirect. And this will often come into play when you get feedback, whether that's feedback on your performance or feedback on your design, on your work, your creative work. Is the person really just saying what they think and not, do you have to like look for the meaning, or is it really right there? Some cultures are very direct, come across as very blunt. if you're from an indirect culture, someone who's really direct can sound rude. If you're from a direct culture, someone who's indirect in the way that they give feedback or talk about things can be hard to figure out what they really mean. So if you are used to direct feedback and you get indirect feedback, you can be kind of confused about, well, was I doing well or was I not doing well? Do I need to improve or do I not need to improve? It's harder to make assumptions about Americans in this way. Americans as a whole are not as direct as people from some cultures like Russia or Germany, but can be more direct than people from other cultures. And it varies a lot by person. So that's just something else to keep in mind. As you build relationships, you're going to build your network. And this isn't so much the network that's intended to help you get a job as it is the network that's going to help you function in your job. So getting to know people, building relationships. And I just wanted to lay out some different ways that you can network at work. To get to know your coworkers. To, as the last point says, find allies, find people who can help you understand what's going on, find people who can help you navigate, help you understand, help you grow. So it starts with that casual conversation, that office small talk. You can ask someone to go for coffee. You know, maybe there's a habit of everybody breaking mid-morning to go get coffee. You can eat lunch together. Especially when you're new, it can be good to go to organized social events that happen outside the workplace. And really, if you're remote, you have to be very intentional about those things, but you can chat remote or in person on Slack or Teams or other company text platforms. So building relationships is something that's going to be important and something that you're going to want to do. All right. Few more things about communication. Are you going to need to email? Are you going to be texting people? Or are you going to be using both? Email is often the main way people in a company communicate with each other. It's been around for 30 years now. It has an established history. People feel like it's durable. You can reference easily back to previous emails. Companies that use email as their main form of communication will tend to be a little bit more formal in how they write an email. And Eilish has put in the chat a link to our resource on emailing like a creative pro. I don't have time to go into today how a great way to start an email, to get to, explain what you need, all of those things. But we have this resource that's a great way to learn some best practices for email. Other companies are more text reliant, whether that's actual text on your phone or whether that's through Slack or Discord or Teams, some text-based interaction platform. Texting is younger. It hasn't been around as long. People who it feels younger, like something of younger people. It often feels more informal and more immediate. Whichever you're using, or both, you want to remember that all of your written communication, whether it's email or text, is likely being saved by the company or can be viewed by the company, usually the IT department. So don't imagine that a text that you send or an email that you send is truly private through a work channel. And a good idea is don't say anything about someone that you wouldn't say to their face. And don't text or email anything that you wouldn't want to be seen by the whole company. That's the best way to protect yourself in that case. But again, the company culture is going to indicate how formal this is, how informal it is, what kind of a mix of texting and emailing that you do. Chances are, if you didn't grow up emailing, you are going to be asked to use email at least some, even if that's only for communicating outside the organization. So it is good to know those email best practices. All right. I'm just going to briefly say part of being a part of a workplace is meetings. So here are some best practices for being in a meeting. You want to prepare in advance. So are you going to be asked to talk about your work? You should be ready to talk about the work that you're doing. Listen and take notes. And then follow up. If there's something you're supposed to do that comes out of the meeting, make sure you do it. If there's communication you're supposed to send, make sure you send it. Understand the purpose of the meeting and why you were invited, and ask good questions. What makes a good question? A good question is about something you don't know and can't figure out. So this is where the internet is your friend, the company resources are your friend. Look and see what you can find out about something first. Do a little research. But a good question is about something you don't know and can't find out. And a good question moves the conversation forward and brings clarity to the discussion. I'm going to skip regular feedback. Wow, this time really flew by. And mention confidentiality. This is the last thing I have to say about communication. This is going to be something you are going to need to do no matter where you're working. Information that is of the companies usually needs to stay in the company. And there's almost always a limit on what you can talk about outside the company. This is really important to employers. It is really important that their designs that they're working on for a new product don't show up on the internet. Sometimes even what you're talking about is something you can't, or what you're designing is something you can't talk about out on the internet. Apple, famous confidentiality around their phone development so that information doesn't get leaked before they want to present it. So always read company policies carefully. Ask questions to be sure you understand those policies. When in doubt, ask if you can talk about something or share something. Be careful with files and data. And ask your supervisor what you can share. This is really more for interns than anything else, but what you can share on social media, in your portfolio, and on your resume. All right, we are at time, but I am free to stay on a little bit longer if you want to stick around and ask some questions. If you need to go, feel free to leave, but I am happy to stay on a little bit longer and take some more questions. I want to point out that if you have a question later, you can email us at careers@artcenter.edu. You can check out our website, like our email guide, our guide on emailing, and you can follow us on Instagram.
Thank you.
Thank you.